Paris, 1661. The Sun King rises over France. Louis XIV, just 23 years old, stands at the window of the Palace of Versailles, watching dawn break over his kingdom. He is already the most powerful monarch in Europe. But power, as we will learn, cannot protect a king from the desires of his own heart. This is the story of how one man's forbidden love would lead to war, betrayal, and the near destruction of everything he had built. A tale of obsession so consuming that it would change the course of European history. But before we understand the destruction, we must first understand the man. Louis XIV was born into chaos. His father, Louis XIII, died when the boy was only 4 years old. His mother, Anne of Austria, became regent, ruling France through the capable but ruthless Cardinal Mazarin. Young Louis learned early that power was something you seized and held with an iron grip. The Fronde Rebellion, a series of civil wars that erupted when Louis was just 10, taught him another lesson. He watched nobles plot against his mother. He saw Paris turn hostile. For weeks, the royal family lived in fear, sometimes fleeing the palace in the dead of night. These childhood terrors would shape the man he became. Never again would nobles threaten his authority. Never again would he show weakness. By 1661, when Mazarin died, Louis was ready. He shocked his court by announcing he would rule alone, without a chief minister. L'État, c'est moi, et vous l'avez déclaré. I am the state. And what a state it was. France was the most populous, wealthy, and militarily powerful nation in Europe. Louis commanded armies that dwarfed those of his neighbors. His court glittered with artists, philosophers, and the finest minds of the age. Molière wrote plays for his amusement. Lully composed music for his balls. The palace at Versailles grew ever more magnificent, a monument to royal power that made other monarchs weep with envy. But Louis was restless. For all his power, something was missing. Enter Marguerite de Beaumont. Or rather, that's what we'll call her, for the woman who would consume the king's heart remains, even now, shrouded in mystery. The records are incomplete, deliberately destroyed, or hidden. What we know comes from whispered accounts, coded letters, and the careful detective work of historians piecing together fragments. She was not French. This much is certain. She came from the Duchy of Lorraine, that small but strategically vital state nestled between France and the Holy Roman Empire. Some accounts describe her as the daughter of a minor noble. Others suggest she was connected to the ducal family itself, perhaps a cousin or niece of Duke Charles IV. What all accounts agree on is this. She was breathtakingly beautiful, exceptionally intelligent, and utterly inappropriate for a king's attention. Louis first saw her in the summer of 1663 at a diplomatic reception in Nancy, Lorraine's capital. He had come on official business, strengthening French influence in the region. She was among the ladies of the court, playing the harpsichord. Their eyes met across the room. For Louis, who had enjoyed the company of many beautiful women, this was different. His official mistress at the time, Louise de la Valliere, was sweet and devoted, but she didn't challenge him. Marguerite did. She was educated, well-read, passionate about politics and philosophy. She argued with him about Descartes. She questioned his policies. She made him think. Within days, Louis was obsessed. But there was a problem. Several problems, actually. First, Louis was married to Maria Theresa of Spain, a marriage arranged to seal peace between France and Spain. She was pious, devoted, and utterly ignored by her husband, but she was still queen. Second, Marguerite herself was promised to another, a German prince from Bavaria, part of a careful diplomatic alliance. Third, and most dangerously, Marguerite's family had connections to the Habsburg dynasty, France's greatest enemy. None of this mattered to Louis. He pursued her with the single-minded determination he brought to everything. Letters flew between Paris and Nancy. Secret meetings were arranged. Louis began making excuses to visit Lorraine, claiming matters of state that fooled no one at court. Marguerite, for her part, was torn. She was drawn to Louis, there's no question. How could she not be? He was the most powerful man in the world, charming, handsome, utterly convinced of his own magnificence. But she also understood what a relationship with him would mean. She would become a mistress, hidden away, never acknowledged, her reputation destroyed. Her family's careful diplomatic position would be compromised. For 2 years, she resisted him. This only inflamed Louis's passion further. He was not accustomed to being denied anything. Then, in 1665, everything changed. Marguerite's betrothed, the Bavarian prince, arrived in Nancy to finally claim his bride. The wedding was set for autumn. In a few short months, Marguerite would leave Lorraine forever, beyond even a king's reach. Louis made his decision. If he couldn't have her honorably, he would have her anyway. And if her family and her nation stood in his way, he would remove those obstacles. What happened next shocked Europe. In September 1665, Louis suddenly declared that certain territories in Lorraine rightfully belonged to France, based on ancient and frankly dubious legal claims going back centuries. He demanded Duke Charles hand them over immediately. When Charles refused, Louis mobilized his army. His ministers were baffled. France had no strategic need for these particular territories. The legal justification was paper-thin. Several advisors pointed this out, and Louis dismissed them from his service. His war minister, Michel Letellier, began preparing for invasion. Though he privately confessed he didn't understand the king's urgency. Only a few people close to Louis understood the real reason. This wasn't about territory. This was about Marguerite. By invading Lorraine, Louis would accomplish several things. First, he would disrupt the wedding, throw the duchy into chaos. Second, he would demonstrate his power, show Marguerite what he could do for her, or to her, depending on her response. Third, and most cynically, he would create a situation where Marguerite's family would need French protection, making her more accessible to him. In October 1665, 50,000 French troops marched into Lorraine. It wasn't even really a war. The duchy's army numbered perhaps 5,000. Duke Charles, seeing the futility of resistance, fled to Austria, seeking help from the Holy Roman Emperor. His court scattered. Marguerite, along with many noble families, sought refuge in the fortified city of Nancy. The Bavarian prince, realizing his bride came with far more complications than he'd bargained for, quietly withdrew his marriage proposal and returned to Munich. Louis had gotten what he wanted. The wedding was canceled. Marguerite was available, but he had also unleashed forces he couldn't fully control. The invasion of Lorraine, so obviously motivated by personal rather than state interests, alarmed every court in Europe. Spain protested. The Dutch Republic, already nervous about French expansion, began strengthening its defenses. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold demanded Louis withdraw immediately. Louis ignored them all. In November, he traveled personally to Nancy, ostensibly to oversee the occupation. In reality, he came for Marguerite. Their reunion was private, held in a commandeered nobleman's house on the outskirts of the city. No official record exists of what they said to each other. But the outcome was clear. Marguerite agreed to become his mistress. Whether this was truly her choice, or whether she felt she had no choice given her circumstances, we'll never know for certain. Louis was triumphant. He had conquered a kingdom for love. In his mind, this was the ultimate expression of royal power and romantic devotion combined. He was a king from chivalric romance, a knight who had won his lady through force of will. The reality was far messier. Installing Marguerite as his mistress required delicate logistics. She couldn't simply appear at Versailles. Louis was still married, still had his official mistress Louise. The queen, though she accepted her husband's infidelities with resignation, had her pride and her Spanish family to consider. Louis's solution was to establish Marguerite in a private chateau near Fontainebleau, about 40 miles from Paris. He would visit her there, away from the scrutiny of court. She would be comfortable, lavishly provided for, but hidden. For Marguerite, it must have been a gilded cage. Cut off from her family, unable to return to Lorraine, dependent entirely on Louis's favor. She occupied her time with reading, music, and correspondence. Some letters survive, carefully worded, revealing little of her true feelings. In one, she writes to a friend that she lives in a beautiful solitude, Whether that's contentment or despair is impossible to say. Meanwhile, the consequences of Louis's invasion of Lorraine were escalating. Spain, seeing France's aggression, broke off diplomatic negotiations over outstanding border disputes. The Dutch Republic, led by the brilliant Johann de Witt, began organizing a defensive coalition. Several German princes, alarmed by French troops so close to their borders, pledged support to Emperor Leopold. Louis's foreign minister, Hugues de Lionne, begged the king to see reason. The occupation of Lorraine was costing France its diplomatic position. For what? Some minor territories and legal arguments no one believed? De Lionne didn't know about Marguerite. Almost no one did. The relationship was one of the most closely guarded secrets in France. But rumors spread anyway. Court gossip suggested the king had a new mistress, someone foreign, someone connected to the Lorraine affair. The rumors were imprecise but persistent. In 1666, Emperor Leopold made his move. He couldn't defeat France militarily, but he could make Louis's position in Lorraine untenable. Leopold assembled a coalition. Austria, Spain, several German states, and surprisingly, Sweden, which feared French expansion might threaten its interests in northern Germany. They issued an ultimatum: withdraw from Lorraine or face war with all of them combined. Louis faced the greatest crisis of his reign. His generals advised withdrawal. Even the occupation was costing enormous amounts of money. Actually, fighting a coalition war would bankrupt the treasury. France was powerful, but not powerful enough to fight all of Europe. But withdrawing meant admitting defeat. It meant abandoning Lorraine, making it impossible to maintain his relationship with Marguerite. She would be forced to return to a duchy that would likely blame her for bringing French invasion. Her life might even be in danger. Louis made a decision that horrified his advisors. He would fight. In March 1667, France declared war on the Habsburg coalition. What followed was not the glorious military campaign Louis envisioned. It was a grinding, expensive, inconclusive conflict that dragged on for over 2 years. French armies initially made progress, pushing into the Spanish Netherlands and securing their position in Lorraine. But victories came at terrible cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers died. The treasury hemorrhaged gold. Taxes rose sharply, causing unrest in Paris and other cities. The war was deeply unpopular. French citizens couldn't understand why their king was fighting over Lorraine, a place most of them had never heard of, while ignoring more obvious strategic objectives. Pamphlets appeared, some daring to criticize Louis directly. The secret police arrested dozens of pamphleteers, but more appeared. At Versailles, the mood was tense. Ministers whispered that the king had lost his mind, that he was acting irrationally. Some suspected there was a woman involved, though they didn't know who. Louise de la Valliere, still officially the king's mistress, knew she had been replaced, but didn't know by whom. She wept in her apartments, wondering what she had done wrong. Only Queen Maria Theresa seemed genuinely unconcerned. She prayed for her husband's soul and continued her charitable works, content in her faith that God would judge all sins in time. Through all of this, Louis visited Marguerite whenever he could, sometimes riding through the night to reach her chateau. With her, he could pretend the war wasn't happening, that he was simply a man in love rather than a king whose obsession was tearing his kingdom apart. But even Marguerite was beginning to understand the cost. In letters from this period, carefully preserved in French archives, we can see her growing distress. She writes about hearing reports of battles, of casualties, of French soldiers dying far from home. "I fear I have become a Helen," she wrote in one letter, referencing the Helen of Troy whose beauty had launched the ancient Greek war. A face that launched not ships, but armies to their doom. She begged Louis to make peace. According to some accounts, they argued about it. Louis insisted he was defending France's honor and interests. Marguerite responded that he was defending his pride, not France. These arguments only seemed to deepen Louis's obsession. He admired her spirit, her willingness to challenge him. By late 1668, the military situation had reached a stalemate. French forces held their positions but couldn't advance. The coalition couldn't push them out but was winning the war of attrition. Both sides were exhausted, bankrupt, and looking for a way out. Peace negotiations began in Aachen. Louis sent his diplomats with instructions to secure France's gains in Lorraine at any cost. The coalition demanded complete French withdrawal. Months of negotiation followed. Then disaster struck. In January 1669, Marguerite fell seriously ill. The exact nature of her illness isn't clear from records. Some historians suggest it was pneumonia. Others point to symptoms suggesting something more serious, perhaps typhoid or even early stages of tuberculosis. Louis, receiving word of her illness, abandoned his responsibilities and raced to her side. He stayed there for 3 weeks, ignoring increasingly desperate messages from Paris. Ministers needed decisions. The army needed direction. The peace negotiations needed guidance. All of it was ignored. This was perhaps the most dangerous moment of Louis's reign. With the king absent and the government effectively paralyzed, there were whispers of a coup. Some nobles began discussing whether Louis was fit to rule. His brother, Philippe, Duke of Orleans, could perhaps be persuaded to take the throne for the good of France. Nothing came of these plots, partly because Philippe himself refused to consider them, remaining loyal to his brother. But the fact they were discussed at all showed how far Louis's authority had fallen. Marguerite recovered slowly. By March, she was out of danger. Louis returned to Paris, haggard and aged by the experience. He had faced the possibility of losing her, and it had shaken him profoundly. But he had also finally been forced to confront what his obsession was costing. His ministers presented him with the facts. France was nearly bankrupt. The army was exhausted. Crops had failed due to peasants being conscripted for war, causing food shortages. There were riots in Lyon and Bordeaux. His own court was on the verge of rebellion. And for what? To maintain control of territories in Lorraine he didn't strategically need, to protect a relationship that brought him private happiness but public disaster. In April 1669, Louis authorized his negotiators to accept terms. The Treaty of Aachen was signed in May. France withdrew from most of Lorraine, retaining only a few border fortifications. Duke Charles returned from exile. The coalition dissolved, satisfied that French expansion had been checked. Louis had lost. Not militarily. The war had been a stalemate, but politically and morally. He had damaged France's position in Europe, wasted the treasury, and earned a reputation for irrational aggression that would haunt French diplomacy for decades. And what of Marguerite? Here the story becomes even more tragic. With French forces withdrawing from Lorraine, her position became untenable. Duke Charles, returning to his duchy, made it clear that anyone who had collaborated with the French occupation, which certainly included her, was unwelcome. Her own family, trying to distance themselves from the scandal, disowned her. She couldn't stay in France openly. Louis still had his queen and his official mistresses, and court politics wouldn't tolerate another complication. The chateau, near Fontainebleau, so recently her refuge, now felt like a prison. In August 1669, Louis and Marguerite made a painful decision. She would leave France, travel to Italy, to Rome specifically, where she could live in relative anonymity under the protection of sympathetic nobles. Louis would provide for her financially, ensure she lived comfortably, but they would likely never see each other again. Their final meeting, in September 1669, must have been devastating. Again, no official record exists, only accounts passed down through servants and courtiers who glimpsed the aftermath. Louis was reportedly inconsolable for days afterward. He shut himself in his chambers, refusing audiences, ignoring state business. When he finally emerged, he was changed. The romantic idealism that had driven him to invade Lorraine was gone, replaced by cold calculation. He would never again let personal feelings interfere with statecraft. His subsequent mistresses, including the famous Madame de Montespan, were carefully chosen for political advantage or at least political neutrality. Love, if he felt it, was subordinate to power. Marguerite reached Rome in October 1669. She lived there for another 32 years, dying in 1701. She never married, never returned to public life. She studied art and theology, corresponded with scholars, and lived quietly. Some letters between her and Louis continued for years, though they became less frequent over time. The last confirmed letter from Louis to her is dated 1673. After that, silence. Louis lived until 1715, dying just shy of his 77th birthday after the longest reign in European history. In his final years, he reportedly told his great-grandson and heir, the future Louis XV, "Do not imitate me in the taste I have had for building, nor in that I have had for war. Try, on the contrary, to be at peace with your neighbors." He never mentioned Marguerite by name, but those close to him, those who had witnessed the Lorraine catastrophe, believe this advice came from that bitter lesson. So what do we make of this story? Was it really love that drove Louis to invade Lorraine? Or was it simply royal arrogance, a king so accustomed to getting his way that rejection became intolerable? Perhaps it was both. Louis was capable of genuine feeling. His grief at Marguerite's departure was real enough. But he was also a king, raised from childhood to believe his desires and France's interests were identical. When Marguerite became something he wanted, his mind couldn't separate that personal desire from national necessity. In his logic, what served his happiness must serve France. This delusion cost France dearly. The Lorraine War and the diplomatic isolation it created weakened France's position, just as other European powers were growing stronger. The financial drain contributed to problems that would eventually culminate in the French Revolution over a century later. The reputation for aggressive, unpredictable behavior made other nations wary of alliances with France. On a human level, the cost was even clearer. Marguerite spent her final decades in exile, cut off from family and country. Louis spent his remaining years haunted by his worst mistake. Tens of thousands of soldiers died for a king's obsession. Countless families were destroyed by the war's economic disruption. And Lorraine itself, the small duchy that had the misfortune of being caught between a king and his beloved, was devastated. Its economy shattered, its population depleted. It would take generations to recover. The duchy eventually was absorbed by France in the 18th century, but by then it was a shadow of what it had been before Louis's invasion. There's a broader lesson here about power and human nature. We often think of great historical events as driven by ideology, religion, economics, or strategic necessity. And usually they are. But sometimes history pivots on something far more ordinary: desire, jealousy, heartbreak. A king's forbidden love, pursued with all the power of the state, can reshape borders and end thousands of lives. Louis XIV is remembered as the Sun King, the absolute monarch who made France the center of European civilization. Versailles remains one of humanity's most magnificent creations, a testament to his vision and will. His reign saw unprecedented achievements in art, literature, and statecraft. But he was also a man who destroyed a kingdom for love, or for what he called love. And in doing so, he learned what all who possess absolute power must eventually learn: that even kings cannot escape the consequences of their choices. That power can command armies but cannot command the heart, his own or anyone else's. That some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. In the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, there's a small leather-bound book, unremarkable from the outside. Inside are pressed flowers, dried long ago, their colors faded to brown. A note in Louis's handwriting identifies them. From the gardens of Nancy, September 1665. The month he invaded Lorraine. The month he thought he could have everything he wanted. He kept those flowers until his death, 50 years later. Perhaps they were a memorial to what he had won and then lost. Or perhaps they were a reminder of the price of putting desire above duty. We'll never know for certain. History preserves facts, but not feelings. We have the treaties, the battle reports, the diplomatic correspondence. What we don't have are the private moments, the conversations between Louis and Marguerite, the thoughts that kept the king away. But we do have the consequences. A war fought for dubious reasons. A kingdom weakened. Lives destroyed. And two people who loved each other, or thought they did, separated forever by the weight of Louis's crown. In the end, the king who tried to have everything ended up with regret. an oppressed flower in a book.